Welcome to part 6 of the 755 Followed Me Home project. If you missed what brought us here, links to the previous videos are posted below. In this episode, the diesel injectors, or in the case of this 755, power washers, spray fuel into a basin and provide more insight into the condition of this 3TN72.
Well, you'll remember when we left off on getting the injectors out and the intake manifold off, we had to get the whole head and manifold assembly off because of the injection pump was hiding this bolt here. Well, now with it out, we have good access. Of course, that one behind the pump would have been the hard one to get out with our fingers. Came right off. Using a 21 millimeter on the base of the injector. I'm just going to give it a little tap. Came right loose. So I can know if there was anything about the injector in the cylinder that was wrong. Put some marks on them. So we'll take number 3 out. A lot of oil around there. A little wet down in there. Alright, we'll take number 2. It's number 1. Okay. Number 3 had a lot of oil around it. Same with number 2. This is as close as I can get with this lens and the camera to show you what the tip looks like. That's number 1, number 3, and number 2. This is the one that had the moisture in it. I don't know if the reflections will show you that, but number 1 down here is dry. The other 2 were pretty wet.
We joined the discussion after I asked Dave about the specifications and what we should see if these injectors are okay.
And even back in the older stuff, they considered that emissions, and so because of that, they don't release the calibration information, that kind of stuff. It also has to do, especially under warranty, also has to do with engine integrity. You know, keeping that not damaging a new motor. All I'm doing now is setting up the tester for the injectors that we're doing. They all have different connectors and different fittings, depending upon how they mount in the engine, different threads, that kind of thing. And also different test pressures. These pencil style injectors that are in the Kubotas are fairly low pressure injector. compared to some of the multi-hole injectors, and so they don't run real high pressures. The later stuff, well, the bigger Kubotas.
It's John Deere.
Okay, this one's a Deere.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
No, that's fine, because they put, this is the Yanmar engine, right?
Right.
Okay. Both the Yanmar and Kubota use very similar systems, and because they use a higher compression, it's a pre-combustion chamber engine, so that they spray into a cup in the head, and okay, I'm gonna lock this gauge out so we get a better pattern of what they do. I have a vacuum here that'll suck some of that spray down into the end. And that's how they.
Yeah, I don't have much light. There you go.
And that's what they do in the cylinder. Now this injector here, how I'm pumping it is a way that it would never actually see in the cylinder. How it works in the cylinder would actually be more like that. And but this is the test.
How does it look?
This one looks pretty good. It looks like the spray pattern is a little wide. And that's typical of an age, is when the spray pattern gets wider. A brand new one has a real a lot finer spray pattern, less fogging on the outside edges of the cone as it comes down. And this one is about 1400 psi. All you need to look up the spec, but I would say that it is probably 500 pounds lower than it should be. Which is, there again, is a factor of age. Number of hours that run them.
Which one was that?
Where'd you have it marked at?
On the caps? Oh, the oiliest one was number 1. It looked like everything, the seals have been leaking on the other two.
Pull this one out here. So I didn't see the marking on the cap. I just assumed it was on the injector itself.
Okay, and we're 1, 2, and 3.
Yep, just how we. And you can see by looking at the tip, this one's had a cleaner burn, and this one's had a cleaner burn. You can see the carbon is built up on this, which isn't necessarily out of the ordinary for us to see a set of tips with carbon on them. But in this particular instance, it's the difference between the three that would lead me to believe that this one may not spray as good or has a cylinder problem. On a set like on this John Deere, you can see all of them are blackened. Maybe some a little more than the others, but it's fairly uniform. Where on the ones that you have there, they're not as uniform. And a lot of times uniformity is what we're looking for, because these are two completely different types of engines. This is a pre-combustion chamber engine. This is a direct injection engine, and so we're just literally looking for uniformity between the injectors out of the same engine. Because as smart as I like to think I am, there's just way too many engines for us to keep track of how they should look when they come in. Different fuel or different, even as much as different fuel deliveries between horsepowers can change that in the same engine model.
Nice light.
Yeah. See, this one doesn't look much different than the other injector that we tested first. And I'm going to check. You can see when I first start, there's a little bit of hosing, we call that. And that's not really an accurate indication of how the injector is operating. It's because we're just pumping a steady volume of pressure out of them. There again, like I showed you before, how it gets hit was with a pulse, and that's more of what it'll do in the engine is a pulse. And so it's not a. Here again, we got roughly the same amount of pressure, about that 1400 psi or 100 kilograms centimeters squared. Typically, these injectors are about 140 kilograms centimeters squared, which is roughly around 2,000. So in this case, it makes me concerned for the engine in that cylinder. Because it doesn't look like it's burning as clean.
I noticed that when you started to flow, it was dribbling off to one side and then it came back into the center.
Sometimes, and I really don't worry about when we first start out, because you can have some carbon on the pintle of the injector that will hold the fuel as it comes past the pintle sticking out. If there's a little carbon on it, it'll cause the fuel to want to pull on it instead of doing what it's supposed to do, which is suck around the pintle and then down. The injection, the fuel actually comes down around the pintle that's in the center, comes down around it, and actually curves and then crisscrosses on each other. And one of the things that's when somebody sees us testing injectors is there's a little misconception. Is that fuel is spraying, you can see it spraying, this far. In the engine, that cup that it's spraying into is usually a little bigger than a quarter in diameter all the way around it. And so that fuel is actually going in and bouncing off the other side during the combustion event. And you don't get a very good feel for that looking at it on a nozzle tester.
Okay, tell me again, what will this nozzle test tell us as far as the injector and also the engine?
Okay. As far as the engine, I can't tell a whole lot from the injectors. Besides the visual that I just was talking about, they're not uniform carbon buildup on the spray tips. As far as the injector goes, I can get a feel for, like I was talking about the width of the cone that comes down. The more wear there is, the wider that cone gets. Also, you can hear that buzzing sound. We call that chatter. That tells you how free the valve is. I don't have that style of injector tip sitting right here, but I have a different style, and they're very similar in that the clearance here between this part of the tip This is where the seal is at, and if there's a lot of scalding or sticking, we won't get that nice chatter to it. It'll do that hosing that we talked, that I said earlier. It'll hose, and that's well, that chatter you hear is actually this needle bouncing up and down off the seat inside, and that means that that's free. If it's got good chatter sound to it, that means that that's free and not binding up. I got that all tightened down now. No, I didn't.
The light.
Yeah. We'll get that.
Give it a sec.
Sometimes we get a little dust. I blow them out so that we limit the amount of dust that's inside of them. That can mess up the spray pattern. Now this one here is about the same pressure, maybe a little lower. And it is 1300, but if you look at the spray pattern, it's a lot coarser, a lot rougher. There's more of the hosing. If I go real slow, I can make it hose off to one side, which again isn't really too much of a factor, but you can see it spreads out to the other side as well when I hit it, and it's just a lot wider cone. So this injector tip here has a lot more spray pattern to it, and it's not clearing up. Sometimes when I hit it hard on the handle, that's actually putting out more fuel than this injector would ever see in its normal operation. I'm trying to flush any poor material out of it. But of the injectors, this one looks the worst as far as how the spray pattern is, and it's also not got that nice buzz to it that the other ones had. It doesn't chatter quite as well. And so this injector here has a lot more wear internally, or has had some damage from some fuel or little flakes of something that has got through the pump. It's not uncommon for us to see one out of a set that is worse than the others. And what I was getting at as far as what we can see, this one had a clean looking nozzle tip, so it was still burning okay in the engine. It wasn't carboning up like the other one was. So in this particular instance, I'm looking at these as they've been in for quite a while because they all have a wide spray pattern. This one particular is worse than the rest, and this one really this nozzle tip should really be replaced. But this one here, where it's all carboned up around it, obviously the fuel's not burning in the cylinder. If we saw an instance where the one with the poor spray pattern also coincided with the poor or with the carbon buildup, then I would suspect that the carbon buildup is from the injector. In this particular instance, I think this is actually more from the engine side of things. And this one, while burning clean, a spray pattern like that can affect smoke at full load, a little more smoke on the engine under load, and also it can really affect starting probably the most, in that the finer the atomization of the fuel, the better starting you get, especially when the cylinders are coldest, because the compression and cylinder temperature is less. So the better atomization, the easier it is for fuel to burst into flame. And so in all, because of all three things that we're seeing, I would suggest those need to be rebuilt and get spray tips in them. The other thing being low on pressure too. They probably got a lot of hours on them, or at least a fair number of hours on them anyway. And because you'll lose pressure over the course of time, number of hours. Besides the fact that the spray patterns get wider, the springs lose tension. You also get wear between where the needle matches up with the spring. It's called a spring seat. You'll get wear in there too, and just a few thousandths worth of wear will affect the pressure. As a general rule in the industry, we figure about 2 thousandths is about 2 thousandths worth of wear is about 100 to 150 psi worth of pressure drop. And so we use that because we shim them back up. These are shimmed, adjusted injectors, which means every time we adjust them, we have to take them completely apart, measure the shim, change it, put it all back together again, and then test it and see where we're at, and then adjust from there.
Does it make sense to rebuild these, or do we replace them?
That is subject to the price of a new one. The labor and the parts, we just need to weigh between the two. Sometimes, especially on this style of injector, sometimes these are fairly inexpensive, in which case it makes no sense to rebuild them. And in other instances, sometimes these are, oddly enough, $300. And in which case, yeah, it's well worth rebuilding them, because the average on these tips, this style of tips, usually is somewhere between $40–50. But if they only use that tip in one very specific application, it's that whole supply and demand thing. If they only use that in some very limited applications, that tip could be $100 by itself. Even though it looks identical to one that's $40, the difference is it flows different. And those things you can't see on this, and you can't see on the engine until you put the wrong ones in the wrong engine, and you figure out real quick what the difference is. But anyway, because they look the same on the outside. A lot of them look the same on the outside, and just, you know, these are out of a John Deere. They literally use these in many applications. There's a dozen different spray tips that go in them, and 2 different manufacturers. This one happens to be Dip and Denso. They also make Bosch ones that look very, very similar to them. Different internal parts, different costs involved. So even though they look the same optically, internally is where the differences are going to be at. So after learning more about the engine and what the compression was, this is the bad part about looking at an injector and making assumptions, is these 2 injectors are cleaner because they weren't firing, and you're getting some fuel washing on the injectors, and it's blowing the carbon off of them. The center one was actually the one that was firing, because it had enough compression to do it, and it was dragging the rest of the other 2 cylinders along, and so it was working harder, and that's why this one's carboned up and these 2 look so clean. The other thing you can get is if you have a water leak because of a head gasket or a crack in a head, you'll get one of these injectors will be real clean, because that water will help steam clean any of the carbon off of the injector. So in this particular instance, this was actually the better cylinder, and even though the spray pattern looks like this one was the worst one, it didn't matter because that cylinder had low enough compression, it wasn't firing. This one had a really good spray pattern, even though it was a little wider. It still should have been firing on a good cylinder. So what you got was diesel fuel washing on the injectors, and then this to knock the carbon off, and then this one here was carboned up because it was having to labor so hard. Everything this was doing was getting full fuel just to keep this engine running, and so it was actually almost, I don't want to say over fueling, but it was running more fuel through this at different RPMs than it normally would, because it was having to carry the rest of the cylinders. So that's why it's really hard to just take one part of it alone, and why I quiz people all the time on I feel like I interrogate people all the time, because I'm trying to figure out, put what I see and what the customer's telling me together to help them solve their problem. It's not just, you can't just look at one thing to help solve that problem. In this particular instance, yeah, these need some work, but they're not solely the problem in this particular instance.